I am Reverend Linda Hottie, one of your co-ministers for this interim year of transition. I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Albany. We are glad you are here to share in our service as we seek to create and discover meaning and purpose for our lives. This is where we work on our spiritual lives together and seek to form a community where all are beloved. We aspire to being radically welcoming and inclusive, so we welcome all people, skinny and round, gay or straight, trans or bi, able or disabled, poor and rich, and everybody in between, long-haired and no-haired, quiet or voluble. Well, you get the idea. We welcome you no matter what kind of human you are, for we are all one race, the human race. Today's service is oriented to a celebration of the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of our most beloved heroes, one of our greatest intellects, one of our greatest moral and spiritual examples. The service was crafted by myself and Nelson Jacobs Moore. I asked him to help me craft the service and to use his beautiful words, his beautiful voice, to read the words of Martin Luther King. We are also grateful to Michael Hornsby for the suggestion of our theme, Peace Through the Eyes of MLKing. Thus, our sermonic questions. What would Dr. King have to say about the wars raging in our world today? What did he say about the wars in his lifetime, particularly Vietnam and conflict in the Middle East? What does peace mean to us? And what can we learn from Dr. King's legacy about creating peace?
For today's call to community, we will tap into the call and response tradition popular in African culture and the Baptist church tradition. In the back of the gray hymnal, you will find number 584, a network of mutuality written by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I will read the call, and if you would please read the response in italics, we will begin to build a peaceful community. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. We must evolve from all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means.
Please join me in reading our words for lighting the chalice. Welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning, we gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community.
Our wisdom story this morning is the parable, A Picture of Peace. And I invite you, as you listen to this story, to use your mind's eye to imagine the two pictures as they're being described. There was once a king who offered a prize to the artist who would paint the best picture of peace. Many artists tried. The king looked at all the pictures, but there were only two he really liked, and he had to choose between them. One picture was of a calm lake. The lake was a perfect mirror, for peaceful, towering mountains were all around it. Overhead was a blue sky with fluffy white clouds. All who saw this picture thought that it was the perfect picture of peace. The other picture had mountains too, but these were rugged and bare. Above was an angry sky from which rain fell and in which lightning played. Down the side of the mountain tumbled a foaming waterfall. This did not look peaceful at all. But when the king looked, he saw behind the waterfall a tiny bush growing in a crack in the rock. In the bush, a mother bird had built her nest. There, in the midst of the rush of angry water, sat the mother bird on her nest in perfect peace. Which picture do you think won the prize? The king chose the second picture. Because, he explained, peace does not mean to be in a place where there is no noise, trouble, or hard work. Peace means to be in the midst of all those things and still be calm in your heart. That is the real meaning of peace.
There are approximately 30 countries at war in our world right now. Those we hear most about are the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, but there are 7 to 8 active wars in the African continent, 8 in the Middle East, 9 in Asia, 2 in Central America, and at least 1 in South America. I suspect that there is some racism, both conscious and unconscious, at play in which countries receive the most coverage from our Western press. But war is as old as humanity. In divinity school, I was horrified the first time in Old Testament that I read the 6th chapter of the book of Joshua, where Joshua tells the Hebrews attacking Jericho that God has given you the city, and you are to destroy all beings in the city, men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and asses, every living thing. That scripture was not emphasized in my Christian upbringing. But I was shocked when I read it and dismayed. This was the entrance into the promised land. And I thought, how could the Hebrews have done that? And what a horrible, pernicious thought that God has given us this city and we are to destroy every living thing. But then, I realized that we European colonialists did something similar in invading the North American continent, pushing out the native peoples, putting them into reservations, and often killing them. And right now on PBS, you can watch Ken Burns' documentary on the destruction of the American buffalo. One who shows us another way and thereby gives us hope is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And today we celebrate his birthday. To do so, we will hear what he had to say on the topics of war and peace and the promise of nonviolence to bring justice without bloodshed. We know that these are very complex issues. There are no easy answers, but we can listen to his words, take them in again, and hopefully learn how to make peace, how to bring peace, how to be peace in the community and the world. Well, what is peace? Well, surely MLKing would know. In 1964, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. The prize brought him international recognition and $54,123, which he donated to the civil rights movement. Ironically, the benefactor of this Peace Prize made his fortune from the invention of dynamite. King looked at peace through many lenses. He looked at it not only through the lens of military battles in the Middle East and Vietnam, but also through lenses of poverty, oppression, discrimination, and injustice, all rooted in racism and what we call today white supremacy. Ultimately, he made his way to India to learn about the power of nonviolence to bring change to a society. It has been a joy to read his works and to read about him again. His writing is brilliant, his education broad and rigorous. He was not only a deep thinker, he also lived his knowledge. Once again, our world seems to be exploding with military conflicts. As we continue to struggle with the legacy of slavery and white supremacy, we asked this morning, what would Dr. King think about peace today? What would he have to say about what is happening in Ukraine and Gaza? What would he tell us about how to work for peace today? So let's begin with the question, what was the meaning of the word peace to Dr. King?
Peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. Be the peace you wish to see in the world. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. We must come to see that at the end, we seek a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The time is always right to do what is right. Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity.
What might King say about today's wars? Was he a total pacifist? The idea that you could inflict extreme violence to bring peace to the world never made sense to him. He felt that a better route than war was to work toward equality, to eliminate poverty, to acknowledge dignity and respect for all persons. That could bring about peace. But he did not completely rule out the use of force.
I felt that while war could never be a positive or absolute good, it could serve as a negative good in the sense of preventing the spread and growth of an evil force. War, I felt, horrible as it is, might be preferable to surrender to a totalitarian system. But more and more, I have come to the conclusion that the potential destructiveness of modern weapons of war totally rules out the possibility of war ever serving again as a negative good. If we assume that mankind has the right to survive, then we must find an alternative to war and destruction. In a day when Sputniks dash through the outer space and guided ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, nobody can win a war. The choice today is no longer between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence.
Throughout the bus boycott in Montgomery, King followed the guiding light of Mahatma Gandhi, who had been assassinated in 1948. King was introduced to Gandhi's writings at Crozier Seminary. After the bus boycott was won in 1959, King embarked on a trip to India to learn about how the ideas of Gandhi had played out there. Dr. King spoke with many of Gandhi's relatives and friends and returned more convinced than ever that nonviolence is the best tool for social change. In 1966, in an essay entitled "Nonviolence, the Only Road to Freedom," he wrote this:
I am convinced that for practical as well as moral reasons, nonviolence offers the only road to freedom for my people. In violent warfare, one must be prepared to face ruthlessly the fact that there will be casualties by the thousands. In Vietnam, the United States has evidently decided that it is willing to slaughter millions, sacrifice some 200,000 men and $20 billion a year to secure the freedom of some 14 million Vietnamese. This is to fight a war on Asian soil where Asians are in the majority. Anyone leading a violent conflict must be willing to make a similar assessment regarding the possible casualties to a minority population confronting a well-armed, wealthy majority with a fanatical right wing that is capable of exterminating the entire Black population and which would not hesitate such an attempt if the survival of white Western materialism were at stake. Not a single person has been killed in a nonviolent demonstration. The bombings of the 16th Street Baptist Church occurred several months after demonstrations stopped. Reverend James Reeb, Mrs. Viola Liuzzo, and Jimmy Lee Jackson were all murdered at night following demonstrations. And fewer people have been killed in 10 years of action across the South than were killed in 3 nights of rioting in Watts. No similar changes have occurred without infinitely more suffering, whether it be Gandhi's drive for independence in India or any African nation's struggle for independence.
Several times while preaching at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Dr. King spoke out against the Vietnam War. But his first major public declaration came on March 25, 1967, when he led an anti-war demonstration in Chicago with more than 5,000 Black and white marchers. His most controversial statement came a few days later in New York City, where he spoke to a meeting of clergy and laity concerned at Riverside Church. It was on April 4th, exactly a year before he was assassinated. He had spoken out about the war before, but this was the first time he linked it to the civil rights movement, and the first time that he directly attacked the Johnson administration's war policy. He began by quoting the opening statement of the Executive Committee of Clergy and Laymen Concerned about Vietnam.
A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for the radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking out about war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask? And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have never really known me, my commitment, or my calling. I deem it a signal importance to try to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. There is a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise for hope for the poor, both Black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything for a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps the more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the Black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia or East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So we watch them in brutal solidarity burning the huts of a poor village, but we realize that they would never live on the same block in Detroit. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor.
The war about which we hear the most right now is that between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. King traveled in the Middle East, thought deeply about the conflicts there, and formed strong opinions. In 1967 in Chicago, he read a statement about the Middle East on behalf of himself and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They felt that SCLC had been unjustly and incorrectly accused of condemning Israel and unqualifiedly endorsing all the policies of the Arab powers. King objected to any simplistic resolution on the Middle East question. A year later, just 10 days before he died, on March 25, 1968, he spoke to the Rabbinical Assembly in a three-way conversation with himself, Rabbi Everett Gendler and Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel, and we bring you excerpts from those two events.
SCLC and I have repeatedly stated that the Middle East problem embodies the related questions of security and development. Israel's right to exist as a state in security is incontestable. At the same time, the great powers have the obligation to recognize that the Arab world is in a state of imposed poverty and backwardness that must threaten peace and harmony. Until a concerted and democratic program of assistance is effected, tensions cannot be relieved. Neither Israel nor its neighbors can live in peace without an underlying basis of economic and social development. At the heart of the problem are oil interests. As the American Jewish Congress has stated, American policies in the Middle East have been motivated in no small measure by the desire to protect the $2.5 trillion stake which U.S. oil companies have invested in the area. Some Arab feudal rulers are no less concerned for oil wealth and neglect the plight of their own peoples. The solution will have to be found in statesmanship by Israel and progressive Arab forces who, in concert with the great powers, recognize the fair and peaceful solutions are the concern of all humanity and must be found. Neither military measures nor a stubborn effort to reverse history can provide a permanent solution for peoples who need and deserve both development and security. The Southern Christian leadership and I have expressly, frequently, and vigorously denounced anti-Semitism and will continue to do so. It is not only that anti-Semitism is immoral, though that alone is enough. It is used to divide the Negro and the Jew, who have effectively collaborated in the struggle for justice. It injures Negroes because it upholds the doctrine of racism, which they have the greatest stake in destroying. The individual Jew or Gentile who may be an exploiter acts out of his greed as an individual, not his religious precepts. Just as a criminal, Negro or white, is expressing his antisocial tendencies, not the ethical values of his race. SCLC will continue tirelessly to denounce racism, whether its form is white supremacy or anti-Semitism. We have made it clear that we cannot be the victims of the notion that you deal with one evil in society by substituting another evil. We cannot substitute one tyranny for another. And for the Black man to be struggling for justice and then turn around and be anti-Semitic is not only a very irrational course, but it is a very immoral course. And whatever we have seen, and wherever we have seen anti-Semitism, we have condemned it with all our might. I think it is necessary to say that what is basic and what is needed in the Middle East is peace. Peace for Israel is one thing. Peace for the Arab side of that world is another thing. Peace for Israel means security, and we must stand with all our might to protect its right to exist, its territorial integrity. I see Israel as one of the great outposts of democracy in the world, and a marvelous example of what can be done, how desert land can almost be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy. Peace for Israel means security, and that security must be a reality. On the other hand, we must see that what peace for the Arab means in a real sense of security on another level. Peace for the Arabs means the kind of economic security that they so desperately need. These nations, as you know, are part of that third world of hunger, of disease, of illiteracy. I think that as long as those conditions exist, there will be tensions. There will be the endless quest to find scapegoats. So there is a need for a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, where we lift those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder and bring them into the mainstream of economic security. This is how we have tried to answer the question and deal with the problem in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I think that represents the thinking of all of those in the Negro community, by and large, who have been thinking about this issue in the Middle East.
In 1966, Dr. King addressed the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association as the Ware Lecturer, one of the major events and speeches of our General Assemblies. He entitled his lecture, "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution."
My own personal experience with Unitarian Universalism began when I was a student at Boston University. And I can remember beyond that in the early years of my ministry, indeed, beyond that in the early years of the bus boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama, 3 of your ministers visited and encouraged me during that very trying and often difficult period. I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and to the self-defeating effects of physical violence. In a day when Sputniks and Geminis are dashing through outer space and ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can win a war. It is no longer a choice between nonviolence and violence. It is now a choice between nonviolence and non-existence. The alternative to disarmament under a strong UN. The alternative to a suspension of nuclear tests. The alternative to a negotiated settlement in Vietnam. And the point of coming to that condition of not bombing the North. The alternative to admitting China may well be a civilization plunged into the abyss of annihilation. And our earthly habitat can be transformed into an inferno that even the mind of Dante could not imagine. Yes, I must confess that I believe firmly that our world is in dire need of a new organization. The International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. Men and women as maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injuries of his day cried out in words that echo across the centuries, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." As maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not survive half slave and half free. As maladjusted as Thomas Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery, cried in words lifted to cosmic proportions, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." As maladjusted as Jesus of Nazareth, who could say to the men and women of his day, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. Through such maladjustment, we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice.
So, what would Dr. King advise us today about peace in our world, in our country, in our own souls? With regard to the war in Gaza, I think he would tell us to try to look at both sides, to not lose sight of the humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians. I think he would call for a ceasefire and for the provision of humanitarian aid in Gaza. I think he would tell us to keep working to overcome white supremacy in our country, our city, our congregation, our own minds and hearts. I think he would tell us to anchor our living in the examples of Gandhi's nonviolence, and not just nonviolence in a physical sense, but also in nonviolent language and thought. I think he would tell us to live out the compassion of the Buddha and the wisdom and compassion of Jesus, and to continue to work for justice. I think he would tell us to develop the strength to love always, and not lose sight of the humanity of those we may call enemies. I want to give the last word to Nelson, not as quoting Dr. King, but as Nelson Jacobs Moore.
We should agree with Dr. King that war has played havoc with the destiny of the entire world. It has torn up the Geneva Agreement. It has seriously impaired the United Nations. It has exacerbated the hatred between continents and, worse still, between races. It has frustrated our development at home to tell our own underprivileged citizens that we place insatiable military demands above their critical needs. I have come to believe that the way to end war is to end poverty, create equality, spread truth and knowledge. As Dr. King said, nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Peace comes with knowledge. May it be so. Asante Sana. Amen.
I invite us to turn inward for a time of silence. If there is to be peace in the world,
there must be peace in the nations.
if there is to be peace in the nations,
There must be peace in the cities.
if there is to be peace in the cities,
There must be peace between neighbors.
if there is to be peace in the congregation,
There must be peace in the soul.
if there is to be peace between neighbors,
There must be peace in the home.
if there is to be peace in the home,
There must be peace in the heart.
I leave you with these words from Martin Luther King's autobiography, written as he reflected on his trip to India to learn from Gandhi about the power of nonviolence. King wrote, "It was a marvelous thing to see the amazing results of a nonviolent campaign. India won her independence, but without violence on the part of the Indians. The aftermath of hatred and bitterness that usually follows a violent campaign was found nowhere in India. The way of acquiescence leads to moral and spiritual suicide. The way of violence leads to bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. But the way of nonviolence leads to redemption and the creation of the beloved community." Amen.
Right. As we extinguish the chalice, please join in the words in the order of service or shown on the screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Oh, thank you.
A lot of work and stress goes into these things. I know that